So let's quickly talk about the Layers tab while we're here talking about the interface. Now, the Layers tab is really the most important aspect of Photoshop, and you're going to become very, very familiar with it. So we've been placing images into Photoshop, and they're placed as layers within a document. So a Photoshop document is everything all comprised together, and each layer is each little part of that document. So for instance, we have a background layer. This is our white background. We have a spaceman layer. This is our spaceman file that we brought in. Let's place another image. I'm going to go File, Place Embedded, select the landscape and click Place. We have our landscape image in here. I'm going to scale it by holding down Shift and dragging, and I'll hit Return. Now notice on the right-hand side, Photoshop has made a new layer called Landscape. So we have Spaceman, Landscape, and Background. Now layers are really where the power of Photoshop is. Basically, you can think of these as almost like layers of paper or photographs or transparency paper or whatever you want to think of it as. They essentially sit on top of each other, with the bottom layer being the bottom and the top layer being the most top. So for example, as I move my landscape, notice it sits on top of my spaceman. If I move my spaceman, notice it sits under my landscape. This is because the layer order matters. So the background's on the bottom, spaceman's in the middle, landscape's on top. Now we can change this layer order simply by clicking and dragging the layers in the Layers panel. So I can drag it down here. So I'm clicking and dragging my landscape down below my spaceman, and I release, and now they've swapped spaces. So my spaceman sits on top of my landscape. This is one of the easiest things to mess up as a beginner, is the layer order. Additionally, the selection of layers is really important. So right now, Spaceman is selected. We can see how it's a slightly lighter shade of gray. It's highlighted. Anything I do, so as I move this around, it's moving the Spaceman around. If I click over here, it's still moving the Spaceman. I can drag this around. So if I come over here and let's say I think I've selected the landscape and I'm trying to move it, whoops, I just moved my spaceman instead. I need to select the landscape layer and then move that around. Now one way around this is to turn on auto select up here. With the move tool, there's a checkbox that says auto select layer. If I check that box, now it works on a more visual basis. So as I select this spaceman, my mouse is over it and I'm clicking and dragging, it's moving the spaceman. If I click and drag over the landscape, notice it automatically switched to the landscape layer. Now, I usually don't recommend having this on. Now, it's good for beginners, but it's kind of a bad habit to get into, so I'll just turn that off. Because it's really important that you're aware of what layer you're on. So I'm on Spaceman, I know I'm moving that, so I could click over here and move it. If I'm on Landscape, I know I'm editing that layer. So changes that we make will affect this layer. If I have this one selected, the changes will affect that layer. It's pretty easy to understand, but it can get really complicated really quickly. In a lot of professional Photoshop documents, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of layers. Layers can affect each other in all different sorts of ways. For instance, you don't need to do this, but I'll show you. I can change the opacity of this layer, so how see-through or visible it is. And notice it interacts with the layer below it. If these were reversed, if this layer was on top of this layer, we don't see that effect as much. So it's really essential that you know your layer order and understand it. Now, one final thing with layers is that you can organize them. If I double click a layer, that lets me edit its name. So I clicked on the text, so I could call this astronaut. If I double click this, I could call this desert. I can also make folders and groups and color coordinate and all sorts of things. If I right click this, I can choose to color the layer a certain way. This can be a really good organizational tool. I'm going to just go ahead and remove those. And whenever you get into these complex Photoshop documents, you'll start using those a lot. But again, this layering, this idea and this concept of layers is important for not only Photoshop, but InDesign, Illustrator, and really graphic design as a whole. One final thing you can do with layers is hide and show them. So there's a little eyeball here. If I click that, it hides the layer, leaves it blank. If I click it, the eyeball reappears, and now we can see the layer. You'll often see me do this in videos to draw your attention to just one layer. If we don't want to edit a layer, we can lock a layer. See how this background has a lock next to it? If I click the lock button right here, it will lock whatever the selected layer is, and I won't be able to edit it.